Hi everyone, welcome to Piedmont Trails. My name is Carol. Got a special presentation coming up for you guys today. We're going to be talking about colonial indentured servants, the lower people. What was an indentured servant? How did it come into play with the original 13 colonies between the time period of the mid 1650s to 1750? This is the onset prior to the American Revolutionary War. We're going to discuss how did indentureship come about? What were all the details that it involved? How many people actually arrived owing a debt and later became known as bond servants? Then we're going to go into detail of the lives that these servants endured. What was it like to be an indentured servant during the colonial period? And last thing I'm going to go into is research, resource links, references that you can use to guide you along the footsteps of your ancestor who may have been a colonial indentured servant. So welcome everyone. This is a special presentation, part of the project that I'm involved in and have been in for several months now. So don't delay, let's get right into it and let's get started with today's segment. Welcome again everyone. Okay, I've got my notes here. I got about 5, 6 pages here of notes. Now, if I happen to leave something out, I will make sure to include it in the comments section and the discussion tab on the YouTube channel. Okay, so, and I'll make a note of it so that you guys will be aware that I have additional information that I wanted to add with this video, and you'll be sure to look at the discussion tab on the Piedmont Trails YouTube channel. All right, let's get started. We've got a lot of information to cover today in this special segment. So what is an indentured servant? A person who traveled to the British colonies in North America, and because they were unwilling or unable to pay for passage, they became bond servants for a period of years to a colonial plantation owner, farmer, merchant, etc. Okay? So is everybody should be on the same page as I am in the proper definition of a colonial indentured servant. That's what that's the definition that applies to them. Many of these people, but not all, were convicts from jail. A few were political or military prisoners. Many were also fleeing from religious prosecutions. They were starving. They were forcibly kidnapped, deceived, and carried out as servants to the larger plantations located in the colonies. They were a mixed people. In other words, they were French, German, Swiss, Protestants from Scotland, and German peasants. They ranged in every age from infancy and they ought to senior citizens, and they also ranged from upper class to lower class. More than half of all immigrants arriving to the colonies south of New England or south of the northern colonies were servants. It was the custom and ordinary way of thinking during the late 17th century to the mid 18th century that people were the foundation for improvement of all plantations. And so the people arrived, the good, the bad, and everyone in between. The bond servants formed the principal labor supply of the earlier settlements. It would be the mid 17th century before the black slaves superseded the white bond servants. The main object here is comprised of 3 things: money, power, and social status or class. A gentleman during the 18th century or in the 17th century was not a bond servant. Let me repeat that. You've got different social statuses in the colonial period. These classes were very important in all of activities that you do. It was in regard to trade. It was in regard to how you ran your plantation, who you were as a citizen in your community. Your social status, your reputation was very highly prized. This was the same throughout all of the colonies. This one particular little stigma right there in colonial period did not change from colony to colony to colony. However, everything else did. If you traveled during 1660 from one colony to the other, you would see it was as if you were traveling to a different country. That's the vast amount of differences that existed among the original 13 colonies. It was that different. The New England colonies, comprised of Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, in that area, pretty much during the latter part of the 17th century, the late 1600s, they pretty much shied away from dealing with indentured servants, and there were several reasons for this. It was causing too much, let's say, drama in the magistrate's court. Indentured servants were given particular rights in this particular area, and there were runaways, and the contracts were beginning to get too much out of hand. They were too much troublesome, so it was a great ordeal to the magistrates in the House Assemblies in those colonies, so they decided to shy away from it. This allowed this indentured servants process to grow in the middle colonies and really start flowing more freely in the southern colonies of North Carolina, South Carolina, and into Georgia. So that's important to remember. I'm moving forward on that. All right, let's keep going here. Let's see. Class was extremely important in all the colonies, as we just stated. And actually, the status quo of a social class was still very evident into the 20th century. And I wanted to share with you guys an example of class and how social status from the colonial period extended into the 20th century. And this is the best example that I could think of, and that is the Titanic. If you've ever heard of the ship of the Titanic, you know that it was over 1,500 people had drowned during that incident. It occurred in 1912. And once you go through the actual documents of who died and who survived and what their stories were, you realize that if you were a third-class passenger, you had 20% survival rate. Whereas if you were a first-class passenger, you had an 80% survival rate of surviving the Titanic. So that's a prime example of social status and moving from the 17th and 18th century and showing an example of it still existing in 20th century America. Okay, fun fact to know. All right, we will go forward. Cheap labor was the main reason for the existence of the colonial indentured servants. It was profitable for English merchants trading to the colonists to load their ships with a cargo of servants. The labor could be transferred to the colonial planters well above the cost of transporting them. It's important to know. It was profitable for the planter to purchase the labor because it allowed the expansion of his farm, his plantation, which allowed growth, money, power, and an even higher social status. It's important to clarify here that the colonies for many people represented a fresh start from a life that represented many restrictions in their homeland. For these people, transporting to the colonies was a way out from their current way of life, and due to the demand of bond servants, they were able to take the voyage where otherwise they could have never been able to do so. I want to stress here, some of these individuals chose to do this. They chose to make their mark on a contract which was sealed and become a bondservant once they arrived in the colonies. They chose to do this. Others were forced to do this. No mistake about it. Regardless if they chose to do it or if they were forced, there was money and profit that was gained by the merchant ships. All merchant ships went through the Trade Act of England, as England controls all trade going into the colonies and all trade going out of the colonies. So make no mistake, merchant ships worked through England to accommodate servants being transferred or transported from their homeland, regardless of where it was, Ireland, it doesn't matter, France, it doesn't matter. These were English merchant ships doing this, and then they arrived with the servants on board. Once they arrived, not all of the servants were accounted for. I was trying to think of the natural number that was allowed per feet of a ship, and it has escaped my memory right now. But an average ship size during the years prior to 1700, between 1700 and 1710, could hold approximately 223 people. And all of the servants were considered the lower people. And another reason that this name has kind of stuck with that is because once they arrived on the ship, they were immediately informed to go down the ladder into the bowels of the ship, and that's where they remained. They were not allowed to come back out until they arrived on land. Majority of individuals succumb to suffocation due to lack of ventilation of airflow. And I'll get more on the details of the voyage as we go forward, but make no mistake about it, it was English merchant companies that were involved with the colonial indentured servants in the colonies. All right. The English government was content in letting this business to be handled by private entrepreneurs. This enabled the English government to aid in populating the colonies more slowly and also washing their hands from any financial or moral responsibility. Even the convicts were handed over to individuals. I need to say another thing about that. Okay. In England, there are documentations and references that are referencing prisoners held in jails in England who are taken from jail, transported down to the merchant ship owners, and released. Here you go. Take this prisoner to the colonies. This is your responsibility now. And they've just released them to the individual, the owner of the merchant ship. The merchant ship owner, now he takes this prisoner and loads him onto the ship. Once he arrives in the colonies, a price is placed upon the passage of bringing this individual to the colonies. He is therefore sold. I'll get more into detail about that and how that process. I don't want to say too much on that right now, but he was sold for the price of his passage. It did not cost very much to transfer these individuals, so the merchants, these ship holders, they gained a great deal of profit from transporting these individuals to the colonies, a great deal of profit. And sometimes there were middlemen there in between. Once a ship docked, there would be men there. Oh, okay, I'm going to buy 20. I'll get these 20. And he will take these 20 individuals, and then he will carry them to a market spot in town in that particular area, and then he would resell them. This person can be sold for such and such amount, and that would result in 4 years, 5 years, 7 years, and so forth. For the majority of colonial indentured servants, it was the most would be more on the onset of landing in the colonies would be 7 years. But as I've researched, I have found indentured servants serving a time of 39 years and longer. So different cases with different reasons. Okay. Now, They shipped them to Maryland and Virginia. Okay, we're going back to these criminals and what I was saying about them. They sold them to the same planters who denounced the English government for allowing them to arrive in the first place. The people residing in the Old World began to worry about their own labor force because there were so many people that were going to the colony. So now all of the countries in the Old World were beginning to worry, well, where are we going to get our labor force from? Migration to the colonies was frowned upon, but the fact remains that bond servant labor transports were never stopped during the time period before the American Revolutionary War. Eventually, the servant trade was relocated to the Germany, Scotland, and Ireland area, which many stories of kidnapping and deceiving are told and have been found. This was in order to keep the profits and the labor that was needed in high demand in the colonies. Okay, so now you're getting to the area after the 17th century, after the 1600s. Now you're beginning to get into the 18th century. Well, England is now not wanting to send any more of their homeless people or their people that are living on the streets or people who are other servants to other masters in that area. They're not wanting to send any more over to the colonies. Let them go to another country and get their servants. So that's what the merchant ship companies start doing. And they start going to Ireland and Germany and Scotland, and they are deceiving a lot of these individuals. They're saying, well, we'll give you free passage. It's free passage to the colonies. It's a whole new way of life. You won't have to worry about being a tenant farmer any longer. You can own your own land in the colonies. Not many were told that once they arrived, they would be signing over their labor for 4 years to 7 years prior to getting this freedom and then possibly obtaining land. So they were deceived. And make no mistake about it, they were also forced. Many merchant companies became so reliable on this profit for their company, and they did not want to see it go away. So they would actually go into small individual villages and communities and actually take people. And that has been documented as well. Okay, these types of records are not going to be located online. I'll just go ahead and tell you this on this part as far as the resources and reference links. I have been researching this for several months now, and majority of these records are not going to be found online. It doesn't matter if you pay for subscription to a huge genealogy-based corporation or not. You're just not going to find them. This is not a popular topic, although I think it should be more popular than what it is. I think it should be discussed a great deal because it comprised of so many individuals that arrived to the colonies prior to the Revolutionary War. And the ironic thing is that once the American Revolutionary War began, a lot of these same individuals who were treated as indentured servants during their first years here were the same heroes and served in the military during the war. So I think it needs to be more discussed openly and not to be viewed downward, but to be uplifted so that we can share all of this information more openly. I think there should be more resources online. And as far as I'm concerned with Piedmont Trails, I hope to be successful in doing this during the upcoming spring and summer months. So we'll see how that goes. Okay. In fact, less than 5%, that's important, less than 5% can be found, records can be found using online sources. Another fact which is disheartening to genealogy researchers is that much of the original paper documents within the original 13 colonies are lost, they're destroyed, or they just simply do not exist on paper form. Much of this research will take you along a journey to the ship's actual business. And it will, I was just thinking of one particular merchant ship company that just quickly came to mind. It will take you to the individual owner, what their lives were actually like, and how this particular labor trade greatly influenced them and changed them and the way they conducted business years later. Trade along the Atlantic included bond servants. So you have two choices of research to find your indentured ancestors. And I'm going to list just four important things to keep in mind whenever you begin researching your colonial indentured servants. Number one is going to be local court records. Number one, local court records. Number two, merchant ship records. Number three, clearance papers under the provisions of the Act of Trade. Clearance papers are going to be what you find on merchant ship companies. They had to obtain, by law, they had to obtain clearance papers from the Act of Trade located in England prior to them transporting servants to the colonies. Okay, and number four is the actual plantation owner records. Servants held little to no rights, but at times punishment would be ordered by the colony's legislative body, and these records associate with the local court records. So if you find information in local court records pertaining to your ancestor, it's more than likely due to a punishment, or it may be due to the individual stating that his rights were abused and he's reporting it to the magistrate. It may be something along those lines. Once a servant was released from his bond, it would be noted on a contract between the two individuals, the plantation owner and the servant. Excuse me. Very few of these documents exist. So it's rare for you to find the complete contract, which was always in two pieces. They were jagged edges and they were placed together like a puzzle, and it's very rare to find these actual original contracts intact today. Each colony handled the servants differently according to law. For the most part, Virginia would hold 5 years for a bond servant's term. Maryland was very well known to uphold 7 years, and majority consisted of 4 years. Now, if a servant was to serve over 5 years, the colonies held strict guidelines which caused the owner of the contract to bring the servant to court and register. So they had to register it on a legal document if it was for a particular individual that was either misbehaving, or they ran away, or they seem to have an attitude, they don't want to work, or they're kind of sickly, or different reasons. If it was over 7 years, then it had to be recorded in a court document of some sort, and that was with every colony. Okay, so that's an important fact to remember. A note about merchant ships. Many of these early companies can be found with much detail in England's trade documents. If you're not aware of the England's colonial, well, I call them colonial, but that's not the proper name for them, but England's trade documents, I will provide links for some of those online sources, but they are a great, an absolute great resource in obtaining more information about these particular ships, these merchant companies that were dealing with these individuals. It's a phenomenal way to research. So as you can see, the average bond servant was an important aspect in regards to trade to the colonies. As the years went by, economic changes, moral changes, and the onset of the American Revolution changed the indentured servant trade forever. 95% of indentured servants served their terms in the colony in which they arrived. It would be rare for a ship to arrive in Virginia and that servant end up doing his indentured servant term in Maryland or North Carolina. That would be pretty rare for them to do so. But now you need to also keep this in mind. They could be sold at various times, and I'll get into more detail about that here in just a second. The main colonies, let's see, the main colonies of the 13 that held the most of indentured colonial servants would be Virginia, number 1, Maryland, number 2, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Massachusetts, and South Carolina. Whenever the demand for labor was prevalent, the ships would arrive and meet that demand. Now I'm going to go back into more of my research. Now during my research so far, I've found that the cause of death for majority of the indentured servants was suffocation. So far in my research, the majority of death occurred prior to the actual indentured servant arriving in the colonies. They died on the ship. This was due to there were very little portholes that were available on the bows of the ship. There was only one entrance for the most part through the ladder, and that was it. They were not allowed back up the ladder. If they were treated very harshly and in some cases killed. This was due to because they did not want a riot to occur on the ship and then the servants take over the ship. Okay, ventilation was terrible. They were fed, but they were fed with stale bread. But for the most part, they were allowed a pint to a pint and a half of water. For adults, children were allowed maybe a half a pint to a pint of water a day, and infants were not fed. Infants were frowned upon, and if you begin your research on this and you look at how merchant ship companies operated, you'll find some very disturbing information about how certain age groups were treated. Okay, let's see. Let's go back to. So during, for the most part, the cause of death occurred from the majority of these servants was prior to them even arriving to the colonies, due to the lack of ventilation while on the voyage to the colonies. They succumbed to it, and so great deal of them, a quarter, I would say a quarter to a third of all passengers that were indentured servants perished on their way to the colonies. It wasn't a great number that affected that with the merchant companies because of so much money they could make to the ones that did make it. That's sad to say, but that was the truth. Rights of a servant. What were the actual rights of a servant? They could not marry. They could not vote. They could not hold property. And they could not trade under any circumstances. If you had a servant who only arrived with the clothes on their back, nothing else, and they have been conducting their service through a couple of years now, and they don't have any clothes, you were not allowed to trade for clothes. Your owner would either provide you with what you had. You were not allowed to trade. You weren't allowed to trade for food. If you were caught doing so in many colonies, it was very rough punishment for you if you were caught doing this. So those are the rights of a servant. And those, for the most part, the rights that I read were the rights for all of the colonies. But you need to research the individual colony to see what additional rights pertained to that servant in that particular area. They were allowed to complain to the magistrate for cruel treatment or injustices that were placed on them by their master. But depending on the area, The situation details in the current political arena affected the outcome of these complaints greatly. So that's got a two-part phrase there. So they were allowed to complain, but it greatly depended on the area that they were residing in, on how that complaint would be played out in its end result. Indentured servants were the bottom of social status. You would know an indentured servant by their appearance, their demeanor, and their lack of personal items. You would recognize them right off. That's an indentured servant. That's a servant. A poor and forgotten people who would, for the most part, rise to the occasion of winning a war and creating a nation. That's the legacy, to me. That's the legacy of the colonial indentured servant. They're poor and they're forgotten and they're unrecognized, and there's very few resources and documents that really bring them into light of today's history and what I feel that should be shared about them. It's so important for us to share all of our history. I wanted to read just a few segments of some letters where a few indentured servants wrote letters back to their homeland. One is from a Richard Frethorn. He was born in England, and he wrote a letter to his parents dated in 1623 describing the harshness of being an indentured servant. And also of Elizabeth Spriggs, who in 1756, she writes the following. What we unfortunate English people suffer here is beyond the probability of you in England to conceive. In other words, what she's writing here is what I have suffered here is being a servant is just so beyond your realm of thinking that you would never be able to understand it. And she's writing this to her parents. She also states that Indian corn and salt are her only meals, and that she longs for clothing to be shipped to her. She ends the letter by saying, "Your undutiful and disobedient child." So it makes me wonder, did Elizabeth Spriggs take it upon herself and say, "I'm going to the colonies to a new life"? So it sounds that way. Not sure. But one leaves one to speculate. John Hammond in 1756 wrote letters as well, but he described a better living conditions, and he went on further to even promote others to follow suit. He writes letters to his homeland. You all need to come to the colonies. It's the greatest of all. He was a servant on a tobacco farm plantation in Connecticut, and apparently he lived a very good life there, and his serving his term was not as bad or as harsh as other stories that I have been able to uncover. What was the life like for an indentured servant? It was harsh, and it was hard, and was lonely, and for many it was filled with despair. There are a few documents that I have found that pertain to families being separated. And even though some of these servants did hold certain rights in the colonies, it was as close as you could get to slavery as slavery is. For many, they slept on dirt floors. There was no fireplace, no fire for them to warm by. Others would be so tired and working out in the fields, they just slept in the fields. Would just lay down right where they ended and stopped working. Majority of a work day would be 6 days a week. It would be from sunrise to sunset, Monday through Saturday, with Sundays off. While others in other locations would work them 7 days a week, from sunrise till sunset. If you were caught running away and you were brought back, you were brought up before the magistrate, and you could have time added to you. It could be 2 years, 4 years, I've seen some documents where it stated up to 5, 7 years added on to a person because they ran away. If you ran away multiple times and you were caught and brought back, you could be branded for life. Some sorts of brandings would be the removal of a finger, um, or branded on the side of the face with a mark. Or other items would be they would hold metal rings and make metal rings around a person's neck. And if you saw a servant that had a metal ring, they would usually be about an inch, 2 inches thick, and it was around their neck, then you knew they were trouble. They've ran away. They've been in trouble. They're bad. It would give them that first impression. And that metal band would not be removed until after their term had been served. I have found where certain individuals would begin gathering other servants together. Let's get together, and if we form a group, we can survive this and we can take over the plantation and they're not going to do anything to us. But that's not right. They did do something to them. And that's how I found one individual who was added on with 39 years of service. It was the rest of his life. And it was demanded by the courts. It was handled as a legal procedure, and the remainder of his life was served as an indentured servant. And it makes you wonder the reason for arriving or leaving your homeland and arriving to the colonies. So, but not all situations were bad. Many came over and served their 4 years and were released from their contract. I also need to add here that indentured servants didn't always arrive from ships. Sometimes indentured servants were already here. And I'll give you an example of this before we end this segment with the research and resource links. I'll give you an example that an individual in Virginia passes away and he leaves a will. He owns property and he also owns servants, and he owns quite a lot of luxury items. However, he has been living his entire life off of others' funds. So at the time of his death, he owes a great amount of money to other individuals. In order to pay off the individuals of the money he owes after his death, his servants are sold again. Then his personal items are sold. His livestock are sold. Any harvest from his fields are sold. Then his personal items are sold from his house. And then once all of that is sold, and his lands are sold, and his house is sold, then it begins with his family. And I have found this to be the case in Virginia, Maryland. I did find one case in Pennsylvania where this happened. And so then it goes down to the children. The children who are minors are sold into as indentured servants. And if money is still owed, then the wife of the deceased is then sold as an indentured servant in order to pay off her husband's debts. So, yes, this happened. This is so much a part of all of our history that I feel it's so important to bring it out in the open and discuss it. I think for the most part, for instance, for our grandparents and our great-grandparents and going back from there, I'm sure it was hard to hear their great-grandparents and their great-grandparents to discuss things of this, because they had heard other stories as well, passed down to generations. And so I'm sure it was difficult. But I think now is the time to where we should really concentrate on the importance of what the colonial indentured servants provided for the colonies and for the new nation that derived from the American Revolutionary War. I think it's very important for us. I wanted to read that one segment, that one little sentence that I Hang on, just bear with me just a second. Oh, I can't find it. I'm sorry, guys, but I wanted to read that again because it's so important to me that we get all of this shared. And yes, indentured, this is it. Indentured servants, thank you for patiently waiting for that. Indentured servants were the bottom of social status. You knew them by their appearance, their demeanor, and their lack of personal items. A poor and forgotten people who would for the most part rise to the occasion of winning a war and creating a new nation. I think it would be safe to say that 80% of us today who reside in the United States of America, who had ancestors from this particular time period in the colonies, we come from a colonial indentured servant class. And I think that as we research and make new discoveries, that we will find that out. And I urge each and every one of you, once you do find that information, share it. Let it, if nothing else, just contact me. I would love to hear from you. I would really love to hear from each and every one of you on your treasures that you find. Okay, I will have research links on the description of this actual video. I will also have more tidbits and research techniques on the discussion tab on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was important for me to get this information to you guys, and I hope it helps you in moving forward and understanding more about indentured servants and how it taken place and affected the 13 colonies. So I think I was very happy to bring it to you guys. I wanted to make sure I shared it with you. Now, our next segment, we're going to go back to Washington County, Tennessee, and we're going to discuss the years between 1770 and 1790. You will not want to miss this segment coming up because it is going to begin going into the origins of the state of Franklin, which is such a fascinating subject to talk about. So be sure to join me for that segment. It'll be coming up soon. All right, you guys, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, remember, don't hesitate. Just always let me know. I'm always here to help you. And thank you so much for joining me today. Our ancestors left an amazing trail to follow. Enjoy your journey to the past today. Thanks.